The hallways of Westlake High School felt a mile long to Theo. Every day, the skinny 14-year-old would keep his head down, clutching his backpack straps like they were lifelines as he navigated the crowded corridors. Today was no different as he slipped past groups of laughing students trying to become invisible. It almost worked. Almost. "Hey, bookworm." A heavy hand slammed against the locker next to Theo's head. "Got my homework done yet?" Theo didn't look up. He knew that voice all too well. Darnell, the basketball team's star forward, and Theo's personal nightmare since orientation day. Darnell wasn't alone. He never was. His two sidekicks, Pete and Rodney, flanked him like bodyguards, already snickering. "I told you I'm not doing your homework," Theo mumbled, immediately regretting the small act of defiance. Darnell's face darkened. "What was that?" He leaned closer. "You forgetting how things work around here." A small crowd began to gather. The hallway suddenly felt smaller, hotter. "Leave him alone," called a voice from across the hall. The art teacher, Ms. Chen, was watching with sharp eyes. "Get to class, all of you." The boys backed off, but not before Darnell whispered, "After school. Behind the gym." It wasn't an invitation, it was a promise. By the time the final bell rang, Theo's stomach was twisted in knots. He considered hiding in the library until everyone left, but he knew that would only make tomorrow worse. So he walked the long way around the school building, tracking his feet with each step. They were waiting, of course. What happened next was quick and humiliating. No serious punches. Darnell was too smart for that. Just enough shoving to send Theo sprawling into the dirt, enough laughter to burn his ears red with shame, and the final insult of his backpack being dumped out across the ground. "Same time tomorrow, bookworm," Darnell called as they walked away, high-fiving each other. Theo gathered his scattered books and papers, his split lip stinging as a single tear escaped despite his best efforts. This wasn't even the worst day this month. The walk home to the Pine Ridge apartments took 20 minutes, each step heavier than the last. He tried to compose himself before entering apartment 3B, but his mother, Sophia, took one look at his face and set down the pot she was washing. "Again?" she asked, her voice tight with a mixture of concern and anger. "That's the third time this month, baby." Theo shrugged, avoiding her eyes. "It's nothing." "That's not nothing," she said, gently touching his swollen lip with a damp cloth. "That's a split lip and a bruised spirit. And I've had enough." Theo watched as something shifted in his mother's expression, determination replacing resignation. She dried her hands on her jeans and reached for her phone, scrolling to a contact Theo had never seen her call before. "Mom, please don't call the school again. It'll just make it worse." Sophia shook her head. "I'm not calling the school." She hesitated, her finger hovering over the call button. "I swore I'd never do this, but—" She stepped onto their small balcony and closed the door behind her. Through the glass, Theo could see her pacing, gesturing with her free hand, occasionally wiping at her eyes. The call lasted less than 5 minutes, but when she came back inside, she looked like she'd aged years. "We're going to have a visitor," she said simply. "My father is coming." "Your father?" Theo's eyes widened. "But you always said." "I know what I said." Sophia cut him off, her voice gentle but firm. "Some things are more important than old grudges. You need help that I can't give you." Theo sat on the worn couch, confused. His grandfather had always been a forbidden topic, a blank space in their family history. All he knew were fragments, that his mother had left her family behind when she married his dad, that there had been some kind of falling out, and that whatever his grandfather did for a living was something his mother wanted no part of. "Who is he?" Theo finally asked. Sophia looked out the window, as if expecting to see someone already there. "His name is Antonio Calabrese," she said quietly. "And before I met your father and moved to this neighborhood, before you were born, he was known as the Ghost, the most feared enforcer for the Rossetti family." "Like mafia?" Theo whispered, the word feeling strange on his tongue. His mother nodded slowly. "Those bullies have no idea who they've been messing with. And neither do you." 3 days after his mom's mysterious phone call, Theo was hunched over his math homework when he heard it, the low purr of an expensive engine cutting through the usual neighborhood noise. He glanced out the window and froze. A sleek Blacktown car, gleaming like a beetle under the streetlights, had pulled up in front of their building. In Pine Ridge Apartments, where most folks drove beat-up sedans or took the bus, that car stuck out like a diamond in dirt. "Mom," Theo called, his voice cracking slightly. "I think he's here." Sophia appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands nervously on a dish towel. She looked younger suddenly, almost like a scared kid herself. "Go change your shirt," she said quietly. Theo hesitated. "He's just my grandfather." "Why do I need to?" "Because first impressions matter to him," she cut in. "Trust me on this." By the time Theo had swapped his faded t-shirt for a button-up, there was a single firm knock at the door. Not a knock that asked permission to enter, but one that announced an arrival. Sophia took a deep breath before opening it. The man who stood in their doorway didn't look like what Theo had imagined. No gold chains, no flashy suit like in the movies. Instead, Antonio Calabrese wore a simple charcoal gray jacket over a crisp white shirt, tailored pants, and leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. He wasn't particularly tall or muscular, but something about how he carried himself made the apartment feel smaller. His hair was silver, combed neatly back from a face lined with age, but still handsome in a stern way. His eyes, dark and alert, scanned the room before settling on Theo. "Sophia," he said finally, his voice carrying just a hint of an accent. He didn't move to hug her. "Dad," she replied stiffly. "Thank you for coming." "You wouldn't have called if it wasn't important." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. In his hand was a small leather suitcase that looked like it cost more than their monthly rent. When those piercing eyes turned fully to Theo, the boy felt rooted to the spot. It was like being x-rayed, examined down to his bones. "So," Antonio said, "this is my grandson." Theo swallowed hard. "Yes, sir, I'm Theo." A faint smile touched the old man's lips. "You have your mother's eyes, but there's something else there too." He set down his suitcase. "Something familiar." "He doesn't have anything of yours," Sophia said quickly, almost protectively. "He's nothing like." "We all carry more than just what shows on the outside, daughter," Antonio replied, his tone gentle but leaving no room for argument. "Blood remembers things the mind tries to forget." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Theo stood awkwardly between them, feeling like a rope in a tug-of-war. "Are you hungry?" Sophia finally asked, breaking the silence. "I made pasta." Antonio nodded. Always room for a home-cooked meal. Dinner was a strange affair. Antonio ate carefully, with the manners of someone used to fine restaurants, while asking casual questions about school and the neighborhood. It was only when they'd finished eating that he addressed the real reason for his visit. "Show me your hands," he said to Theo. Confused, Theo placed his hands palm down on the table. His grandfather studied them, then turned them over. "Soft," he commented. "Never done a day's hard work or thrown a proper punch." He looked up at Theo's split lip. "But someone's been using their fists on you." Theo's face burned with shame. "They're bigger than me. There's 3 of them." "Numbers don't matter," Antonio said simply. "My whole life, I never lost a fight. Not because I was the biggest or strongest, but because I understood something most people don't." "What's that?" Theo couldn't help asking. "That real power isn't about muscle." Antonio tapped his temple. "It's about what's up here, and knowing things about people they think nobody knows." Sophia stood up abruptly. "He doesn't need to learn that kind of thing from you." "What kind would you prefer he learn?" Antonio asked. "The kind where he keeps coming home bleeding." Mother and grandfather stared at each other in silent challenge. "1 month," Antonio finally said. "Give me 1 month with the boy. I won't teach him to hurt anyone, just how to make sure no one hurts him again." Later that night, as Theo helped his grandfather make up the pull-out couch, he worked up the courage to ask, "Were you really in the mafia?" Antonio looked at him for a long moment. "I protected people who couldn't protect themselves," he said carefully. "Sometimes that meant working outside the law." He smoothed the sheet with practiced hands. "But that's not what I'm here to teach you." "What are you here to teach me?" The old man smiled, a real smile this time. "How to walk into a room full of wolves without becoming their dinner." The community center gym smelled of old rubber mats and floor polish. At 6 in the morning, it was empty except for Theo and his grandfather, their footsteps echoing off the high ceiling. Theo stifled a yawn. He'd never been up this early, not even for school field trips. "Why are we here so early?" he asked, his voice bouncing around the empty space. Antonio was dressed in black sweatpants and a gray t-shirt that looked brand new. Despite his age, he moved with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own skin. "Best time to train," he replied, dropping a small duffel bag on a bench. No distractions. Theo had expected boxing gloves or maybe those hand pads fighters used in movies. Instead, Antonio pulled out a notebook and pen. "Sit," he said, pointing to the bench. Confused, Theo sat. This wasn't how he imagined learning to fight. "First lesson," Antonio began, "has nothing to do with your fists." He stood in front of Theo, hands clasped behind his back. "Stand up." Theo stood. "No, not like that. Stand up like you mean it." Theo straightened his back a little more. Antonio shook his head. "You're standing like someone waiting to be knocked down." He demonstrated, planting his feet shoulder-width apart, back straight but not stiff, chin slightly tucked. Like this, balanced, ready. For the next hour, they didn't throw a single punch. Instead, Antonio taught Theo how to stand, how to walk, how to make eye contact without staring or looking away too quickly. "Power isn't about your fists," Antonio explained as they practiced walking across the gym floor. "It's about your presence, how you enter a room, how you carry yourself." Theo tried again, mimicking his grandfather's confident stride. "Better," Antonio nodded. "Remember, you're not trying to look tough. You're trying to look like someone who doesn't need to prove anything." By the time they finished, Theo's legs ached from maintaining proper posture, but he felt different somehow. Taller, maybe. "Tomorrow, we observe," Antonio said as they packed up. "After school, don't avoid those boys. Watch them instead." "Watch them do what? Beat me up?" Theo frowned. "Watch them like I taught you today. See what they're really saying with how they stand, how they move." Antonio handed him the notebook. "Write it down, everything you notice." At school that day, Theo felt self-conscious trying his new walk. A few kids glanced at him curiously, but nobody said anything. When Darnell and his friends appeared in the cafeteria, Theo's first instinct was to shrink down in his seat. Instead, remembering his grandfather's words, he sat up straighter and watched them. For the first time, he really looked at Darnell, not just as the scary bully, but as a person. He noticed how Darnell laughed too loudly at his own jokes, how he kept checking to make sure his friends were still impressed by him, how his shoulders tensed whenever the basketball coach walked by. That evening, Theo and Antonio met at a small coffee shop across from the school. "What did you see?" Antonio asked. Theo opened his notebook and began sharing his observations. Antonio listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding. "You noticed good things," he said when Theo finished. "Now, what does it tell you?" Theo thought for a moment. Darnell's afraid of disappointing the coach. "Maybe. What else?" "He needs his friends to think he's tough." Antonio's eyes crinkled slightly. "And what does that tell you about him?" Theo's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "He's insecure." "Exactly." Antonio stirred his espresso. "In my business, I rarely needed violence. The most powerful weapon was knowing more about someone than they wanted me to know." For the next week, they developed a routine. Mornings in the gym, working on what Antonio called physical presence. Afternoons observing and taking notes. Evenings analyzing what they'd seen. Theo learned to spot when someone was putting on a brave face. He learned to recognize the signs of a bluff. He learned that bullies, deep down, were often the most frightened people in the room. "But what do I do when they come after me?" Theo finally asked one night as they walked home. "All this watching and standing tall is good, but when they push me..." Antonio stopped walking. "Tomorrow, we'll practice something different." The next day, they met in the gym as usual, but this time Antonio had brought a friend, Mr. Wilson, who taught self-defense classes at the community center. "I'm not teaching you to fight," Antonio clarified. "I'm teaching you to end a fight before it begins." Mr. Wilson demonstrated 3 simple moves, not fancy martial arts, but practical ways to block a punch, create distance, and if necessary, disable an attacker just long enough to get away. "Remember," Antonio said as Theo practiced, "these are last resorts. Your best weapon is still up here." He tapped his head. A good observer can diffuse most situations with words alone. After practice, they sat on the bench, drinking water. My mom said you were an enforcer, Theo said hesitantly. Doesn't that mean you hurt people? Antonio was quiet for a long moment. In my world, reputation was everything. Most times, all I needed was to walk into a room. People knew who I was, what I could do. He looked at Theo. The real power wasn't in hurting people. It was in them knowing I could, but choosing not to. Is that what you're teaching me? To scare people? No. Antonio put a hand on Theo's shoulder. I'm teaching you to be unafraid. There's a difference. As they packed up to leave, Antonio handed Theo a small worn book, Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Read this, he said. Especially the parts about winning without fighting. That's what we're aiming for. Theo tucked the book in his backpack, feeling for the first time since the bullying started that maybe, just maybe, things could change. 3 weeks into Antonio's stay, Theo stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his collar. He didn't look different on the outside, still the same skinny kid with dark eyes and a nervous smile. But something had changed. He could feel it. Ready for school? Antonio asked from the doorway. Theo nodded. I think so. Remember what we practiced. Don't try too hard. Just be. The walk to Westlake High felt different that morning. Theo kept his pace steady, his gaze forward. He noticed a neighbor wave from her porch and returned the greeting with a nod that felt natural, not forced. Small steps. The real test came as he approached the school entrance. His usual route would have taken him through the side door, avoiding the main hallway where Darnell and his crew usually hung out. Today, he walked straight through the front doors. A few heads turned as he passed, not because he looked different, but because he moved different. No hunched shoulders, no darting eyes searching for escape routes. Just a boy walking to class like he had every right to be there. He made it halfway to his locker before Darnell spotted him. Well, look who it is, Darnell called out, lunging against the wall with Pete and Rodney flanking him. Bookworm finally crawled out of his hole. Theo continued walking, maintaining the same steady pace. 3 more steps. 2. 1. As he drew level with the trio, Darnell pushed off from the wall and stepped directly into his path. I'm talking to you, he said, his voice carrying that edge that usually made Theo's stomach knot up. This time, Theo stopped and met Darnell's gaze. Not challenging, not cowering. Just present. I heard you, he said simply. Something flickered in Darnell's eyes. Confusion, maybe. This wasn't the script they usually followed. You think you're tough now? Darnell moved closer, using his height advantage to loom over Theo. Theo didn't back up. In his mind, he heard Antonio's voice. Asterisk observe. Listen. Find the weakness asterisk. He noticed Darnell's left hand clenching and unclenching. The way his eyes flickered toward the basketball team's trophy case. The faint dark circles under his eyes. I don't think I'm tough, Theo replied, his voice steady. Just done being afraid. Pete snickered. He's watched too many movies. Darnell raised a hand, grabbing Theo's shirt front, pushing him back toward the lockers. This was the moment Theo had been dreading. The moment when all Antonio's lessons about presence and observation would crash against the simple reality of being physically outmatched. But he remembered the other lessons too. The practical ones from Mr. Wilson about creating space, about standing your ground without escalating. Your dad missed your basketball game again yesterday, Theo said quietly, just loud enough for Darnell to hear. That must hurt. Darnell's grip loosened, his eyes widening. What did you say? I was there, in the stands. You kept looking at the door between plays. Theo held Darnell's gaze. You scored 22 points, and no one from your family saw it. The hand fell away from Theo's shirt. Darnell took a step back, his face a mixture of anger and something more vulnerable. You don't know anything about me, he muttered, but the threat had gone out of his voice. Maybe not, Theo agreed. But I know what it's like when people don't see you. For a moment, they stood in silence, the usual power dynamic between them shifting like sand underfoot. Come on, man, Rodney said, breaking the tension. We're going to be late for class. Darnell gave Theo one last look, unreadable and complex, before turning away. Whatever. He's not worth it. As they walked off, Theo let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands were shaking slightly, but he'd stood his ground. More importantly, he'd seen Darnell, really seen him, maybe for the first time. By lunch period, the story had spread through school in that mysterious way high school gossip travels. Details changed with each retelling. Some said Theo had threatened Darnell. Others said they'd fought and Theo had won somehow. The truth, that words had accomplished what fists could not, was too mundane for the rumor mill. What didn't change was how people looked at Theo now. The glances were curious rather than dismissive. A girl from his math class asked if he could help her with homework. The volleyball captain nodded to him in the hallway. What happened? His friend Kyle asked, sliding into the seat across from him at lunch. Everyone's talking about you and Darnell. Theo shrugged. Nothing really, just stood up for myself. Yeah, but how? Last week you were practically hiding in the bathroom to avoid him. Theo thought about how to explain the subtle lessons Antonio had been teaching him, about presence, about truly seeing people, about finding strength in stillness. Let's just say I had a good teacher, he finally said. Someone who showed me that real power isn't about being the scariest person in the room. As they ate, Theo noticed Darnell sitting with his team across the cafeteria. For once, the older boy wasn't loudly commanding attention. Instead, he was picking at his food, quieter than usual. Sometimes, Theo realized really seeing someone was the most powerful move of all. The small Italian restaurant tucked away on Seba Street looked ordinary from the outside, but the moment Theo stepped through the door with Antonio, he knew this place was special. The owner, a round-faced man with salt and pepper hair, dropped the glass he was polishing when he spotted them. Antonio, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Antonio Calabresi. Hello, Vincent, Antonio replied with a slight nod. It's been a while. Vincent hurried over, clasping Antonio's hand in both of his. 20 years at least. We all thought you'd retired to Florida or something. His eyes shifted to Theo. And who's this young man? My grandson, Antonio said, his voice carrying a hint of pride that made Theo stand a little taller. Vincent's eyebrows shot up. Grandson. He studied Theo with new interest. I didn't know you had. There's a lot of catching up to do, Antonio cut in smoothly. Perhaps over dinner? Your back room available? 5 minutes later, they were seated in a private dining area with red leather booths and photos of old Italy on the walls. Vincent brought them menus personally, along with a bottle of sparkling water and fresh bread. On the house, he insisted before disappearing back to the kitchen. As they ate, Theo worked up the courage to ask the questions that had been building since his confrontation with Darnell. Grandpa, he began, testing the word that still felt new on his tongue, what exactly did you do? Mom never talks about it. Antonio finished chewing a bite of his pasta before answering. I protected people who couldn't protect themselves. Like a bodyguard. A faint smile touched Antonio's lips. Sometimes, but mostly, I protected businesses like Vincent's here. He gestured around the restaurant. 25 years ago, some local troublemakers tried to extort money from him, threatened his family. What did you do to them? Theo asked, both eager and afraid to hear the answer. I had a conversation, Antonio said simply. Made them understand that Vincent was under the protection of the Rossetti family. He sipped his water. They decided to try their luck elsewhere. Just from talking to them. Words carry weight when backed by reputation, Antonio explained. Our family protected people who couldn't protect themselves. In return, they showed their gratitude. Theo chewed his bread thoughtfully. So you were like neighborhood security. A genuine laugh escaped Antonio. That's one way to put it. Not how the FBI would describe it, though. The rest of dinner passed with lighter conversation, Antonio sharing stories of growing up in the old neighborhood, of Theo's mother as a stubborn young girl. It wasn't until they were walking home under the streetlights that the subject returned to Antonio's past. Did you ever? Theo hesitated, struggling to find the right words. Did you have to hurt people? For real? Antonio was quiet for so long that Theo thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. The reputation that kept people in line, it had to come from somewhere. He looked at Theo directly. I'm not proud of everything I did, but I always had lines I wouldn't cross. Rules I lived by. What kind of rules? Never harm innocents. Keep your word. Protect your family at all costs. Antonio's pace slowed. Your mother didn't approve. She wanted a different life for herself. For you. They turned a corner, and Theo noticed three men standing under a streetlight ahead. Something about their posture, the way they were positioned to block the sidewalk, sent a warning signal through his mind. Antonio noticed too. His entire demeanor shifted subtly. Nothing obvious, no dramatic squaring of shoulders or clenched fists, but suddenly he seemed larger somehow, more solid. The change was so subtle Theo might have missed it if he hadn't been practicing those same techniques. As they approached, one of the men stepped forward. He wore an expensive-looking jacket and too much cologne. "Mr. Calabrese," he said nervously, "we didn't know you were back in town." "Just visiting family," Antonio replied, his voice pleasant but carrying an undercurrent that made the words sound like more than they were. The man's eyes flickered to Theo, then back to Antonio. "Of course. We wouldn't want to intrude on family time." He gestured to his companions. "We'll be on our way. Give my regards to Nick," Antonio added as they moved aside. "Yes, sir, absolutely." Once the men were out of earshot, Theo let out a breath. Who were they? "Business associates," Antonio said vaguely. "From the old days." "They seemed scared of you." "Respectful," Antonio corrected. "There's a difference." When they reached their apartment building, Antonio paused at the entrance. "What you saw tonight, that's what it really meant to be a Calabrese. Not violence. Presence. Respect." "Is that why you're teaching me all this stuff? To follow in your footsteps?" Antonio shook his head firmly. "No. I'm teaching you because the world can be hard on boys who stand alone. I want you to stand tall." He placed a hand on Theo's shoulder. "But your path is your own to choose, not your mother's, not mine." As they climbed the stairs to their apartment, Theo thought about the family legacy he carried in his blood. Not just the intimidation he'd witnessed tonight, but the principles behind it. Protection, loyalty, standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Maybe there was a way to carry that forward without the darker parts of his grandfather's past. "I think I understand now," Theo said as they reached their door, "about what you meant by real power." Antonio's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Did you?" "It's not about making people afraid. It's about making them feel safe when you're on their side." For the first time since his arrival, Antonio pulled Theo into a brief, fierce hug. "Now that," he said quietly, "is truly understanding what it means to be a Calabrese." Word traveled fast in certain circles. Within days of Antonio's visit to Vincent's restaurant, whispers spread through the neighborhood about the return of the ghost Calabrese and his young grandson. Most people simply filed the information away as interesting gossip. But for a few, it was a potential opportunity or threat. Kevin Walsh was one of those people. As the owner of a chain of dry cleaning stores with questionable bookkeeping practices, he'd had run-ins with the Rossetti family years ago. Now, as he sat in his spacious office overlooking the city, he tapped his fingers impatiently on his mahogany desk. "You're sure it's him?" he asked the man seated across from him. "Antonio Calabrese." "Positive," his assistant confirmed. "Been staying with his daughter and grandson in Pine Ridge Apartments for almost a month now." Kevin leaned back, considering this information. Interesting timing. Right when we're negotiating that property deal. His eyes narrowed. Could be coincidence. Or could be someone called in a favor, the assistant suggested. "Either way, I want to know what he's up to." Kevin pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. "And I think I know how to find out." At school the next day, Theo noticed something different about Jackson, one of Darnell's friends. While Darnell had kept a wary distance since their confrontation, Jackson seemed to be watching Theo with new interest. During lunch, he even sat at the table next to Theo's, close enough to overhear conversations. When Theo mentioned this to Antonio during their evening walk, his grandfather's expression darkened slightly. "Trust your instincts," he said. "If something feels wrong, it probably is." "Maybe he just wants to be friends," Theo suggested hopefully. Antonio shook his head. "Maybe, but be careful what you share." The warning proved prescient. 2 days later, Theo was packing up after final period when Jackson approached, flanked by 2 seniors Theo recognized from the football team. "Hey, book kid," Jackson called, his voice carrying across the nearly empty classroom. "Need to talk to you." Theo straightened, remembering his posture training. "About what?" "Heard your grandpa's been teaching you some tricks." Jackson's smile didn't reach his eyes. My dad says old man Calabrese used to be somebody important. A cold feeling settled in Theo's stomach. He glanced toward the door, but the football players had positioned themselves to block the exit. Don't know what you're talking about, Theo said, buying time. His eyes scanned the room, noting the teacher's empty desk, the partially open window, the heavy textbooks within reach. Jackson stepped closer. Dad wants to know what the old man is really doing back in town. Says it might be worth something to us if you shared some information. My grandfather's just visiting family, Theo said, keeping his voice steady. Nothing interesting to share. That's not what we heard. Jackson's pretense of friendliness dropped. We heard he's working for someone, looking into my dad's business. He nodded to the football players. Maybe we need to convince you to be more helpful. This wasn't like the confrontation with Darnell. These boys weren't looking for social status or trying to impress their friends. There was something colder, more calculated in their approach. Theo thought about running, but the odds weren't good. He thought about fighting, but even with what Mr. Wilson had taught him, he couldn't take on 3 of them. Then he remembered another of Antonio's lessons. Asterisk, sometimes your best weapon is what you know asterisk. Your dad is Kevin Walsh, right? Theo asked, surprising Jackson. Yeah, so what? The same Kevin Walsh who owns Walsh Cleaners and has been trying to buy the old community center property. Theo kept his voice casual as he leaned against a desk. The one who's been moving money through fake companies to avoid taxes. Jackson's face went from threatening to shocked. How did you? My grandfather taught me to pay attention, Theo said, feeling a strange calm settle over him. I've been practicing. Did you know your dad meets with a man in a blue suit every Tuesday at the coffee shop on 4th Street? Always at 3:15. Always with a brown envelope. None of this was true, at least, not that Theo knew of. But the way Jackson's face paled suggested he'd hit uncomfortably close to something real. You're making that up? Jackson said, but his voice had lost its edge. Maybe. Theo shrugged. Maybe my grandfather taught me more than just how to stand up straight. He met Jackson's eyes directly. Or maybe you should tell your dad that if he's curious about my grandfather, he should ask him directly, not send his kid to threaten me. The football players exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't the confrontation they'd expected. My grandfather taught me that knowledge is better protection than violence. Theo continued, gaining confidence. We should all remember that. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Jackson took a step back. Whatever, he muttered. This is stupid anyway. He glanced at the football players. Come on, let's go. As they left, Theo let out a shaky breath. His knees felt weak, and his hands were trembling, but he'd stood his ground without throwing a single punch. That evening, as Theo recounted what had happened, Antonio listened with an unreadable expression. You bluffed, he said when Theo finished. It worked, didn't it? Theo couldn't help feeling a little proud. This time. Antonio's voice was serious. But bluffs can be dangerous if called. You got lucky. I remembered what you said about using knowledge as a weapon. Yes, but real knowledge, not made-up facts. Antonio paced the small living room. This Kevin Walsh, he's not someone to play games with. You know him? I know of him. Antonio stopped pacing. He's not connected to the old families, but he thinks he is. That makes him unpredictable. Later that night, Theo overheard Antonio on the phone in the kitchen, speaking too quietly to make out the words. When he emerged, his face was set in grim lines. We need to talk, he said, sitting across from Theo at the table. The situation is more complicated than I thought. Because of what happened with Jackson. Partly. It seems Mr. Walsh has been causing problems for several businesses in this neighborhood, including Vincent's restaurant and the community center where we train. Antonio clasped his hands together. He's trying to buy up property for some development project, and he's not being nice about it. And he thinks you're here to stop him. Antonio nodded, which wasn't true until now. A small smile touched his lips. But if he's bringing children into this, perhaps I do need to pay him a visit. What are you going to do? Theo asked, feeling both worried and curious. Nothing violent, Antonio assured him. Just a conversation. But before that happens, we need to make sure you're safe. He looked at Theo with pride. You handled yourself well today, used your head instead of your fists, but this isn't over yet. What should I do? Keep your eyes open, stay with friends, and remember everything I've taught you." Antonio reached across the table and squeezed Theo's hand. "Most importantly, remember that being strong doesn't mean standing alone. It means knowing when to ask for help." As he lay in bed that night, Theo thought about how much had changed in just a few weeks. He'd gone from hiding from bullies to standing up to threats, from feeling powerless to understanding true power. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't face it alone. The morning sunlight streamed through the community center windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Theo sat on a bench, watching as people filed in, kids from school, local shop owners, even Ms. Chen, his art teacher. Vincent from the restaurant brought trays of pastries, setting them on a table at the back. "Quite a turnout," Antonio commented, appearing beside Theo in his usual quiet way. "I still can't believe they all came," Theo said. It had been Antonio's idea, but Theo had done most of the organizing, calling people, putting up flyers, speaking to local business owners. A community meeting to discuss neighborhood preservation was how they'd build it. In reality, it was about Kevin Walsh and his aggressive property buyouts. "People will show up when something matters to them," Antonio said, "and having their homes and businesses protected matters." The past week had been busy. After the confrontation with Jackson, Antonio had spent days making calls and visiting old contacts. Theo had worried his grandfather might resort to intimidation tactics, but instead, Antonio had done something unexpected. He'd gathered information and built alliances. "Ready?" Antonio asked as the last seats filled. Theo nodded, though his stomach fluttered with nerves. Standing up to bullies in school was one thing. Addressing a room full of adults was something else entirely. Yet when he took his place at the front of the room, he found himself standing taller, breathing deeper. He could feel Antonio's lessons in his bones now. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice clear and steady. "Most of you know me as the quiet kid from Pine Ridge Apartments. But over the past month, I've learned something important from my grandfather, that communities are strongest when they stand together." As Theo explained the situation with Walsh's development company, he saw nods of recognition around the room. Many had already received pressure to sell their properties or had seen rent increases in buildings Walsh had acquired. "He thinks we're easy targets because we're not connected or organized," Theo continued. "Because some of us are new to the neighborhood, or don't speak English well, or can't afford lawyers." Mr. Garcia, who owned the corner grocery, raised his hand. "What can we do? He has money and connections at City Hall." Before Theo could answer, the door at the back of the room swung open. Kevin Walsh himself walked in, flanked by two men in expensive suits. Jackson trailed behind, looking uncomfortable. The room fell silent. "Well," Walsh said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet space, "isn't this cozy?" "A neighborhood meeting, and somehow my invitation got lost." His eyes locked on Antonio. "Though I see the guest of honor is here." Antonio remained seated, seemingly relaxed. "Mr. Walsh, we were just discussing community development. Your favorite topic, I believe." Walsh smiled thinly. "I prefer to call it progress, something this neighborhood desperately needs." He surveyed the room. "I'm offering fair prices for outdated properties. The smart ones will take the deal before values drop further." Theo felt a surge of anger at the man's arrogance, but he remembered Antonio's lessons. Stay calm. Control the conversation. "We were actually talking about a different kind of progress," Theo said, drawing Walsh's attention. "The kind where existing businesses can thrive and residents can afford to stay in their homes." Walsh's eyebrows lifted slightly. "And you are?" "Theo Johnson, the grandson you sent your son to threaten." A murmur ran through the crowd. Walsh shot a quick glance at Jackson, who studied his shoes. "I don't know what you're talking about," Walsh said smoothly. "But children shouldn't meddle in business matters." "Maybe not," came a new voice from the doorway, "but I'm not a child." Theo's mother Sophia walked in, carrying a folder. In the months since Antonio had arrived, she'd kept her distance from his lessons with Theo. Today, though, she looked different, confident, determined, and very much like her father. "Ms. Johnson," Walsh acknowledged with a nod. "You work for the city planning office, don't you?" "A minor clerk, if I recall." "Administrative assistant to the zoning commissioner," Sophia corrected. She held up the folder. with access to all proposed development plans and their approval status. Walsh's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Including, Sophia continued, your application to rezone this area for high-rise development. The one that's based on environmental impact statements that don't match the actual survey data. Now Walsh did react, his face hardening. Those documents are confidential. Yes, Sophia agreed. They are. And they'll stay that way if you reconsider your approach to this neighborhood. For a tense moment, no one spoke. Theo looked from his mother to his grandfather, seeing the same steady resolve in both their faces. Finally, Walsh smiled, a real smile this time, with a hint of grudging respect. I see the family resemblance now. He adjusted his tie. Perhaps we should discuss a compromise. A development plan that includes the existing community. Perhaps we should, Antonio agreed. Over dinner at Vincent's, tomorrow at 7. I'll bring my architects, Walsh said. You bring your neighborhood committee. After Walsh and his entourage left, the meeting erupted into excited conversation. Plans were made, a formal committee established, and contact information exchanged. Through it all, Theo watched his mother and grandfather working side by side, their old differences set aside in service of something bigger. Later that evening, as they walked home together, all three of them, Antonio broke a comfortable silence. You did well today, he told Theo. Standing your ground without making enemies. Finding a path everyone could walk. I had good teachers, Theo replied, glancing between his mother and grandfather. You know, Sophia said, when I left home all those years ago, it was because I thought there was only one way to be a Calabrese, the hard way, the way that often hurt people. She looked at her father. I didn't want that for my son. Antonio nodded slowly. I understood, even then, but there was never just one way to be a Calabrese. He placed a hand on Theo's shoulder. Your son shows me that. As they reached their apartment building, Antonio paused on the steps. My month is almost up. I should be heading back soon. You could stay longer, Sophia said, surprising both Theo and Antonio. If you wanted. The look that passed between father and daughter carried years of hurt, but also new understanding. For a little while, Antonio agreed. I'd like to see how this neighborhood committee works out. Inside the apartment, as Sophia made coffee, Theo sat with his grandfather by the window. Everything's different now, Theo said. At school, people who never noticed me before want to talk. Darnell even asked if I wanted to play basketball with his friends. And do you? Want to play basketball? Theo smiled. Not really. But Taylor asked if I could help start a peer support group for kids who get picked on or feel like they don't belong. And that interests you? Yeah, using what you taught me to help other kids stand up for themselves, not by fighting, but by finding their own strength. Theo hesitated. Is that weird? That I want to use what I learned from a Mafia enforcer. Antonio finished, his eyes crinkling with amusement. Not weird at all. The best parts of what I taught you had nothing to do with fear or threats. They were about respect, observation, and helping people stand tall. He leaned back, looking older but somehow more at peace than when he'd arrived. You're a Calabrese in the ways that matter. You protect your own, you stand your ground, and you remember that true power comes from lifting others up, not putting them down. The next morning at school, Theo walked the hallways with new purpose. Kids who had once ignored him now nodded in greeting. When he passed Darnell, they exchanged respectful nods. Even Jackson gave him a grudging glance of acknowledgement. But the real change wasn't in how others saw him. It was in how he saw himself, no longer a victim, not a bully, but someone who carried the best parts of his family's legacy. Someone who knew that true strength wasn't about making others feel small, but about helping them stand tall beside you. As he sat down in his first class, he opened his notebook, the one Antonio had given him for observations, and wrote a single line on the first page. The Calabrese way. Protect your own. Stand your ground. Lift others up. It was a good place to start.